Good day to everyone tuning in from across the globe. A very warm welcome to this GCMT webinar, proudly brought to you in collaboration with our impact partner, the Boston Consulting Group. I'm Grace, Partnerships Manager here at the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization, GCMD. I know many of you were expecting to see Dr. Sanjay Pudhan, our Chief Strategy Officer. So unfortunately, he's unable to join us today due to last-minute commitments, and he has asked me to step in. So, while I may not be able to fill his shoes because it's a size 12, I will do my best. Thank you. So at GCMD, our mission is to bridge the gap between ambition and action in the maritime decarbonization. We do this through high-impact pilots, robust testing, and collaboration across the ecosystem to unlock real, scalable solutions that moves us closer to net zero. So today we turn our attention to a pivotal component of the carbon capture value chain, which is CO2 shipping. And with estimates suggesting that up to 170 million tons of CO2 will be needed to transport globally by 2050, and the majority of that within APAC, this is a moment for us, for the industry to come together and rise to the challenge. So we are joined today by an exceptional panel of experts to unpack where the sector stands, the hurdle that remains, and the action needed to enable large-scale deployment. So let's get started, and I'll pass on the time to Kelvin from BCG on his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelvin. I'm a principal at BCG Singapore and one of the co-authors of the publication. It's great to see many of you joining us today for this webinar. I will just spend a few minutes recapping the summary of the report before we dive into a panel discussion. So moving over to the first slide. In the report, we established that there is quite a sizable opportunity for the shipping industry to play a role in the transport of CO2, in particular over long distance, over vast oceans. For this, we see two regions in particular emerging, which are Northwestern Europe and APAC. And based on the cost modeling exercise we did for this report, right, as a general rule of thumb, right, we see a threshold of 500 kilometers as a minimum for offshore transportation, where shipping begins to become more economically advantageous compared to pipeline. Translating this to opportunities in real numbers, right, this means by 2050, we would need up to 150 vessels in Asia Pacific, up to 200 globally, which could require investments of up to $25 billion in APAC and 30 billion globally. And compared to Europe, right, for Asia, the longer distance shipping distance and the larger vessels we require could lead to disproportionately higher investment. Moving to the next slide. In the report, we also examined various technical considerations around pressure, temperature conditions, impurities in the CO2 stream, and how all of this affects the interoperability of infrastructure. We also looked at the end-to-end economics of the cross-border CCUS value chain, including and focusing on shipping, and we compared that to carbon pricing in Asia. We took account of the various challenges and issues we uncovered through the various interviews, workshops, literature review we did, and we've distilled that into a few actions, right, and interventions which are required to activate the shipping industry. First, direct economic support from government is critical, right, given the significant gap we see today between carbon pricing and the cost of cross-border CCUS through shipping. Second, to establish demand certainty, right, for commercials and operational reasons, vessel operators, terminal operators also need long-term contracts to have that certainty. Thirdly, to facilitate the right infrastructure development for interoperability, we need clarity around purity specifications, pressure, temperature conditions. And beyond all this, right, given the nature of CO2 moving between national borders, between jurisdictions, the government-to-government coordination agreements are also critical for establishing regulatory clarity. That's all from me in terms of recapping the key takeaways from our report. I will hand over to our moderator, Carl, and the panelists, right, for more in-depth discussion on the different topics we touched on in the report. Carl, over to you.
Thank you, Calvin. And very much want to just extend our thanks as a team, both of the panelists, but also authors and developers of the report, for the vast interest in the work and also the strong level of attendance for today's webinar. And also a special thanks to some of those organizations and participants who have also sent some questions in advance, some of which we will endeavour and attempt to cover during the webinar discussion today. Very briefly about myself, my name is Carl Clayton. I'm a partner at BCG, based in our Dubai office, but I globally co-lead BCG CCUS topic, so spend lots of my time between Asia and the Middle East, and mainly in Europe as well. And I will be moderating the panel today. The focus of the panel will go through a number of different key topics. We will initially spend a little bit of time thinking through perspective on the regulatory landscape in Asia Pacific and some of the key nuances and some of the key specificities that are emerging and required. We will then spend a bit more time on the perspective on the ships and the vessels themselves, followed by a walkthrough and some discussion in and around the impact of CO2 storage, the sinks, and how companies are considering how to orchestrate their sinks to take advantage of this growing regional demand. And then we will also spend some time touching on the actual technical perspective of the entire value chain and some of the key technical considerations around shipping pressure, temperature, and purity specifications. Before we dive in, I would like to ask our panelists to all give you a brief introduction to themselves, their organizations, and their role within CCUS, so that you get to understand more about their expertise and why they are, part of our panelists today. So it would be great if I could ask Cheryl to start us off with a brief introduction to yourself.
Hey, thanks, Carl. Thank you for picking the lady first. So nice to meet everybody online. Good morning, good afternoon. So Cheryl Ng, I'm based in Singapore. I'm an engineer by background. I've been 20 years in Shell, and largely in commercial roles. So currently now I head up the commercial and new business development team within Shipping and Maritime, covering Asia Pacific and Middle East. So Shipping and Maritime is the center for maritime expertise within the Shell Group. And my team in particular, we are looking to provide commercial maritime solutions to the range of businesses, Shell businesses, as well as our customers from downstream traditional oil and gas players to integrated gas and upstream assets, both Shell operated ventures and non-operated ventures. And the last but not least, we are working a lot in developing the businesses for tomorrow. So looking at liquid hydrogens, value chains, and as well as CCS. Myself and the team, we have been working, let's say, a good 3 to 4 years on CO2 shipping development within Asia Pacific to enable the CCS value chains within Asia Pacific, and significantly longer, right? Almost half a decade, 5 years, working on CO2 shipping for within Europe. So behind me in my background is actually one of the Northern Lights vessels. So there are already 2 on water, and one of them came by Singapore in January this year, and we had the opportunity to visit the vessel, and which is already now in Europe. I'll hand it over to Alex, I think, as the next panelist.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. My name's Alex Apantis. I work for the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. I'm based out of Brisbane on the east coast of Australia. I've been working on CCS since 2006, I guess the first 10 years with Rio Tinto when we were actually trying to develop CCS projects, and the last 9 years with the Global CCS Institute. So the Institute is a not-for-profit international think tank. We have a total staff of 50 to 60 people spread thinly across the world. So we do try and cover the whole globe. And our mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage for climate mitigation purposes. And if I might spend 30 seconds on a free plug, we are running our Asia Pacific Forum in Kuala Lumpur, 6 to 8 May. So only in a few weeks. If you're interested in anything to do with CCS, particularly in Asia Pacific, including shipping, have a look at our website and I encourage you to register. Thank you. Back to you, Carl.
It would be great to now ask Dimitri if you would be able to give us an introduction.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Dimitri Kosiak. I'm a development manager for Angel CCS Hub, which is being developed by a group of companies, which is Woodside, which is I'm representing today, BP, Mimi, Shell, and Chevron. Woodside is the largest oil and gas company located in Australia. I'm talking with you today from a small town of Perth on the west coast of Australia, and we have global operations, namely in US, in Australia, in Senegal, and other countries. So my role is I'm development manager for Angel CCS. Just to give a bit of a context, Angel CCS is a large-scale multi-user hub. It is located in Western Australia in the northwest of the state. We are developing it with our long-term partners of BP, Mimi, Shell, and Chevron. And at the heart of this project is a depleted or produced very large and very high quality reservoir called Angel. That's where the name of the project is coming from. This truly remarkable reservoir could hold in excess of 125 million tons of CO2. CO2 for our project is likely to be sourced from domestic hard-to-abate industries, but we're also looking to bring CO2 via ships from longer distances, which could be located in Australia as well as in APAC region. For us, large scale is key. Hence, the ability to import CO2 at scale is very important for us, as it allows us to reduce the unit cost for our customers. We are currently in pre-FEED phase. We are actively marketing our capacity, and we are the most advanced projects with storage located in Australian waters. That's about me.
Thank you, Dimitri. And then finally, Enkiong, if you would be able to give us a download of yourself and also your role within the GCMD.
Thanks, Carl. Good day to everyone. My name is Enkiong. I'm Director of Projects at GCMD, leading the Unlocking the Carbon Value Chain initiatives. Our main focus is to decarbonize the maritime sectors. And so for that, my focus is on the onboard carbon capture and storage systems. But a lot of questions pertaining to the system is what happens after you capture the CO2? And that's where the carbon value chain comes into play, where you offload the captured CO2 at ports. Then you probably aggregate it and ship it to a final destination, be it utilization or permanent storage. And that's why in today's webinar, you see CO2 shipping and you see GCMD, because shipping the captured CO2 is also part of the value chain and part of our work. And we also are the joint sponsors of the report with BCG. Okay, my background is in environmental engineering. So back to Carl.
Thank you very much. So I think, as you've heard from our guests, lots of ranges of different experiences across the value chain. I think one of the points that Cheryl raised is that, CO2 shipping is advancing elsewhere in the world, primarily currently on the Northern Lights CCS project in Europe. One of the benefits for Norway and the development of that project is that most of the emitters that they're aggregating into that project are linked together through, the EU ETS, meaning that there is a common, carbon trading framework that sits within the ecosystem. And also across many of the EU countries, you have the CCS directive. So I think, a simpler starting position, let's say, than trying to, align multiple countries here within Asia Pacific. So with that in mind, I think, Alex, maybe we'll start with a few questions around how the regulatory landscape is evolving here in the region. To simply start, what are the key elements for the audience that are needed to really activate this market here in APAC for, the cross-border transportation of CO2?
Thanks, Carl. Well, I guess initially, countries that are seeking to store carbon dioxide, of course, must have regulation that enables that to occur. So, comprehensive regulation that covers the full life cycle of the, exploration, development, operation, closure, post-closure of a geological CO2 storage resource. That's absolutely critical, because without that, of course, there's no ability to, in some cases, even explore for pore space, let alone utilize the pore space. So So that's critically important, and I'm pleased to say that there has been quite a lot of progress in over the past year or two. Particularly Malaysia and Indonesia have brought regulation legislation forwards much more quickly than you would see in Australia, for example. So congratulations to those two countries in particular. And other countries are also working on theirs. Thailand are working on theirs, for example. Timor-Leste are also looking at developing regulations for the storage of carbon dioxide. So that's absolutely critical. You must have that there to enable project developers to have the property rights needed and the certainty around regulatory risk compliance requirements, etc., around developing and operating and ultimately closing and dealing with liability, long-term liability from the storage of carbon dioxide. Assuming you have that in place in countries that are seeking to store carbon dioxide, you then need to make sure that international treaties, etc., are being appropriately managed. So the obvious example here is the London Protocol. Countries such as Australia, Japan, Philippines, I think, from memory, are parties to the London Protocol. And they have specific obligations under that protocol to ensure that the marine environment is protected. So if any of these countries that are parties to the London Protocol are involved in trade of CO2, they need to be assured that the way that carbon dioxide is going to be managed and stored in the other country, even if they're not a party, are going to meet the requirements and that they're able to ensure that they're meeting their obligations under the London Protocol. And the one way that they can do that, of course, is to establish a bilateral agreement with the government that's receiving the carbon dioxide, and the bilateral agreement will have several particulars in it. One of them will be around ensuring that the CO2 is being managed appropriately, that the receiving government has the right regulation and processes in place to ensure it's managed appropriately and that the marine environment is protected. And I imagine as these develop, will also be provisions that allow for independent verification, auditing, etc., by the country who's sending the CO2 of the country that's receiving the CO2, so they can continue to report against their London Protocol obligations. Of course, there needs to be clarity around carbon accounting as well. The integrity of carbon accounting is absolutely critical here. So bilateral agreements between governments will need to set the parameters around how carbon accounting will work, how the credit, if I can put it that way, for the abatement that value chain is delivering is being allocated. And there are opportunities for countries to negotiate that. It needn't all be with the country that's paying for the CO2 to be transported and stored. So I think really they're the critical issues: regulation for storage, bilateral agreements that address a number of things, including compliance with international treaties such as the London Protocol, where that's applicable. And then, of course, in those bilateral agreements, other critical issues such as carbon accounting, liability. I didn't mention, I'll mention that now, how long-term liability is managed, how carbon crediting is to be managed, how ownership of the CO2 changes actually as it crosses over borders. I think they're the critical things.
Maybe Alex, to press, as I think you were maybe going to go into it already, and we did have a few pre-questions from the audience before, is around the long-term liability and the way that within the regulations, specific countries are looking to address this liability and essentially the pass back of liability from the operators to the to the permits and to the permitting state or the permitting operator.
Yeah, so in generally, jurisdictions that have geological storage legislation in place allow for the transfer of the long-term liability for the CO2 which has been stored back to the state after a predetermined period or a minimum predetermined period. So, for example, it might be 20 years. 20 years after closure, assuming that the site is behaving in the way that is acceptable and as expected, then the government has the option or the obligation, depending upon the regulation, of taking the liability from the owner of that, the former operator of that site. So it gives operators line of sight to not having a perpetual undefined liability on their books forever, which would make investment very, very difficult. In terms of where there's an international value chain and carbon dioxide is being exported from one country into another. Generally speaking, you would expect that the starting point for those discussions, and this is just a starting point, would be that the country that is receiving and storing the carbon dioxide and being paid to do so also will need to manage the liability associated with that carbon dioxide. And the reason I say that is because they have the regulations and the ability to enforce, verify, etc., whereas the country that's sending them the carbon dioxide, of course, has no jurisdiction outside their own country. So that would be, I expect, the starting point for these discussions. The storing country is responsible for managing the carbon dioxide that they've received and that they are storing because they're being paid to do so. And then the way that the storing country manages that liability, of course, is up to the storing country. But generally speaking, I would expect a similar sort of model where the operator retains liability until such time as a period has passed after the closure of the site and monitoring demonstrates the site is behaving in an acceptable way. Then the state has the opportunity to take the liability from the operator.
Thanks, Alex. And I think for the next question, we'll again keep the hot seat on you, but we'll also, potentially invite Dimitri and Cheryl to provide a perspective as well. But I think another area on the regulatory side, which would be interesting to hear more about, is how governments and also the private sector are going to be able to collaborate to create the right level of economic incentive to do this, right? Because I think regulation is one, challenge that has to be resolved. But beyond regulation, we have to create an investable market and something that's economically attractive to all of the operators across the value chain. What's the general view that how things are evolving here in APAC and maybe where things need to go a little bit quicker?
I think where we are in APAC is if you look at the first tranche of CCS projects generally, they are essentially national oil companies that are re-injecting reservoir carbon dioxide into reservoirs that they know very well because they're within their tenements. And of course, in setting these projects up, they're also planning to be able to receive carbon dioxide from third parties and store that for third parties for a fee. And now we have two of these projects that are in construction right now. Essentially, there's Tangguh by BP in Indonesia, which is enhanced gas recovery as well. So that's another source of revenue that helps the commerciality of the project. And then there's the Kasawari project that Malaysia is developing. That's dedicated storage. So those projects are able to get to FID because they're being developed by very large national oil companies with very strong balance sheets and one shareholder, and that the shareholder is the government. The government essentially has determined that this is a priority and is happy to take at least a theoretical slight haircut on the return on the investment from this national oil company because of this investment in CCS, which in the short term at least is not going to create any revenue for the company. So that's how the first projects are proceeding. Going forwards, though, we're going to need a lot more than that. So if you look at all of the modelling and analysis that's been done for the region and in fact for any part of the world, you'll see that CCS plays an absolutely critical role. And to meet the sorts of volumes of carbon dioxide that need to be captured, transported and stored in order to be consistent with commitments for net zero, which pretty much every country in the region has a commitment to achieve net zero or carbon neutrality by around the middle of the century or as late as 2070, I think. There needs to be a pretty significant increase of the order of 1 or 2 gigatons of CO2 per year, depending upon your assumptions, in this region alone, captured and stored. And that's going to require much stronger policy to create the business case for investment. And at the end of the day, CCS is no different to any other long-term, long-lived, capital-intensive asset. You need to make a return. It needs to be profitable or create value for the investor. Otherwise, the investment simply won't come. And the social need that we all have for a stable climate won't be met. So policies need to come forwards that help to build that business case. And there are many ways to skin that cat. There already are some in the region. There are some tax exemptions, for example, for capital equipment in Malaysia. There are some tax incentives also in Indonesia. And then you have the national oil companies, in essence, investing on behalf of their governments. So the region has started down this path. But the big challenge is what comes next. After these relatively low-cost projects are developed, because they have very low capture costs, the CO2 was already produced as part of normal operations. How do we advance to the next phase, which requires capture from industrial sources and capture from power stations, particularly power stations in this region? Is critical for power in Asia Pacific. That's going to require a mixture, I believe, of incentive policies that reward you for making the investment, and ultimately carbon pricing as well. And I think this will evolve over time. That's my view. I think the policy environment will evolve over time. There'll be a long-term trajectory of increasingly supportive / stringent climate policy, as we've seen globally. That's a global macro trend that will appear here as well, to some extent driven by international trade policies such as CBAM, for example. And over time, that will build the business case for investment, which will bring more capital into CCS projects. It's a really important issue, Carl. There's still lots of work to do.
Very much so, very much so. And I think, things like contracts for differences and other forms of incentive are very highly likely to emerge quickly. Cheryl, I don't know if there's anything that you'd maybe like to add, or Dimitri, from both of your perspectives as as an operator that's really looking to both develop the projects but also support emitters as well.
Yeah, Carl, happy to chime in, Dimitri, if you don't mind. I was just saying, indeed, you guys mentioned about tax incentives. Of course, if you look at Northern Lights, there are outright grants from the government, or in Europe, for instance. And we talk about contracts for differences. So I think a lot of the Asia Pacific countries are modeling that. I think the difference in the complexity versus Tangguh will be, those are still domestic CCS projects. And that's where cross-border CCS projects will have a next hurdle of challenge, right? So how do we incentivize either the emitter country providing support, economic support for the host country, or the host country also providing support for the emitter country? I think that's where it gets complicated. And what we have seen, especially for cross-border projects, is that even if the emitter country is thinking of incentives and support mechanisms, primarily it is focused on helping their emissions. So on the capture onshore side, as opposed to the transport storage part, which they see as the host country or the host operator's responsibility. Yeah. So I'm sure Dimitri would have something to add on that as well.
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic for discussion, and we probably can talk just fill up the hour just talking about that. I think just a couple of thoughts from me. Obviously and clearly, we see the tendency that the CCS projects that are starting up, there are other links to a source, and therefore there is some economic benefit of doing that, or they have been heavily funded by the hosting governments, and of course. None of them are, truly transboundary projects. The only transboundary project that is currently that has currently been sanctioned is the Yarra to Northern Lights, and that's a commercial project. So there is no sort of government participation in that. But however. Government has already underpinned phase one, so the majority of infrastructure is already in place, right? So there is a substantial role that the government would play. Now, which government would play that role is an interesting topic in itself, because a lot of countries are incentivized to reduce their emissions and support their hard-to-abate industry. And well, not incentivized. They have to look at incentivizing them, because they don't have storage capacity themselves. They have to look outside, and therefore they're perhaps the trigger of putting some of those arrangements in place. From Australia's perspective, and I guess from the hosting government perspective, of course, we need to have government-to-government agreements before we can start talking about anything that would bring any sort of incentives into the mix for the hosting infrastructure. But within Australia, sort of tackling the domestic emissions, one of the key opportunities that we see is the funding of the common use infrastructure. And that's, for example, what Western Australia is doing by providing funding to a pipeline, common use pipeline infrastructure. So there's a couple of things where hosting governments would be helpful. It's just a matter of which one is pushing, which one is pulling.
Very good. Thank you very much, guys. That was extremely insightful, and I'm sure the audience would agree with me here. So I think from a regulatory perspective, I think Dimitri, you made a good point. We could definitely use the full webinar talking through all of these points. So I think in the interest of time, let's maybe move on to talk a little bit more about the shipping value chain. And maybe Cheryl, given Shell are probably as experienced as you can find in this market today, I think you will have some very unique perspectives on this aspect. And maybe we could start off, if you could give us some views on, what do you see as some of the key challenges and also opportunities for, value chain entities participating in this kind of like emerging market here in the Asia Pacific region?
Indeed, happy to share. So I think as Kelvin alluded to, right, and then we covered in the BCG study and GCMD study, I think the opportunity is massive. And shipping companies that I know, I mean, are true born and bred entrepreneurs. They see an opportunity when it comes, and definitely we do see a lot of appetite and interest from shipping companies, and may that be operators, yachts, owners. I think a lot of people kind of see this as potentially the next LNG market, and are very, very keen to build expertise and experience. So if I just throw back a little bit of Northern Lights, right? So when we went out with our phase 1 shipping tender with yachts owners, not so much interest, to be honest. Yeah, but then when we recently have taken FID on phase 2, that's where we really have a wealth of all the very credible global international players, yachts owners, operators who are very, very interested to play a part in the CCS value chain. But I think I don't want to label the point too much, right? But in Asia Pacific, particularly, where the key challenges is really the regulatory uncertainty or the lack of certainty. Yeah, CCS doesn't come cheap. And I mean, depends on where you're looking the emissions from to the store. It can range anything from a few hundred, like $100 per ton to $200 to $300. So it's a very expensive venture from the capture, the export terminal, the shipping itself into the import terminal, into storing and permanently ensuring that it was to be sequestered within the stores for many years to come. So that's where the cost of doing a full CCS value chain doesn't come cheap versus the cost of carbon to date. So I think for a lot of shipping companies, the question is how much do you want to invest now, and the timing of the investment, to make sure that the demand signals are present, the regulatory support, the economic drivers, the willingness to pay for the emitters are there for them to start investing. Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe then to take this into a slightly more technical domain, from like a combination perspective, because assuming you've looked across of all the different types of ways of transporting CO2, what are some of the best combinations that are likely to be available today, but are also going to kind of mature as things move forward when we think about some of the key factors, right, around like vessel capacities, the pressure conditions of the shipping, and then also just the sheer distance, right? Because I think compared to Northern Lights, when we're talking a few hundred kilometers, when we get into the APAC ecosystem, we're starting to talk about a few thousand kilometers in some scenarios. So it would be great to hear a bit more about like the technical specifics of the shipping.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Carl. I mean, I would love for a one-size-fits-all solution for shipping within of CO2, but I mean, unfortunately, I think it needs to fit the purpose. So let's say, I mean, obviously in Europe and even in the US, a lot of pipeline solutions, quite some onshore storage and some offshore storage as well. So shorter distances. So I wouldn't cover pipeline here, but obviously shipping. CO2 shipping really provides the flexibility and scalability for CO2 transport and CCS. So just treat it as a virtual pipeline, right? So it can really cover multiple emissions, emitter hubs, and send it to ultimately multiple different storage locations. So I think in the study itself, and to be honest, Shell has looked at it, right? For the three various different pressure regimes, if you call medium pressure, low pressure, and elevated pressure, there are merits of each. We have worked and are working on all three. Medium pressure is definitely a solution that is more prevalent in Europe. As I mentioned, the first 2 and the first 4 Northern Lights vessels will be medium pressure. For the next phase of Northern Lights vessels, we are also still looking at the medium pressure vessels. These are smaller vessel types. The first few Northern Lights vessels are 7,500 cube. We might scale it up a little bit bigger for the next phase. Within Asia Pacific, we believe that low pressure is the way to go. It's the way to be able to get cost competitive end-to-end value chains, especially when you are able to scale up to larger quantities across longer distances. I mean, obviously, being a shipping person, I do it in nautical miles. But so let's say, right, easy convention, you just multiply by 2. So if you look within European waters, maybe 200 to 300 nautical miles, so 500 kilometers. But within Asia Pacific, those are significantly longer distances, longer voyage times. That's where low pressure shipping really allows larger tanks to be built with thinner yet stronger material, allows you to carry more vessel types, carry more CO2 on board. And I think the important thing is that there will be multiple terminals as well as multiple vessels that will be plying the region. So it's critical to be able to look at compatibility of the terminal and the vessel, as well as interoperability between the various different hubs, whether those are emitter hubs or stores. And I think the last thing I want to cover is that obviously elevated pressure is an available solution out there. Even within the Shell, we are working on a joint industry project with DNV looking at elevated pressure for direct injection. So that means without the need for a terminal at the store site.
I don't know, Eng Kyung, if you'd maybe also like to chime in here with a few perspectives that we discovered during the piece of work.
I think Cheryl brought up a very good point in terms of the state of the liquefied CO2 shipping would like to transport via different distances. But I think the key to realize that type of value chain is also dependent on the specifications of the liquefied CO2. And I think there's some concerns that people saying that when you go to the low pressure regime, it's very close to the triple point, and that gets a lot of people very edgy in terms of how comfortable is the sectors able to handle that CO2 at that kind of state. So I think it's important that we have a better clarity in terms of the allowable impurities. And that's why when you say harmonize the specification, if you look at this type of regime, which is more sensitive, there need to be collections of all the specs of the captured CO2 from the emitter side versus that of the well. And I'm of the understanding that this is not necessary to be similar to the Northern Light regime, because that is from a multiple emitter to one source. Whereas in Asia-Pac side, there is a possibility because of the larger emitter to do a point-to-point and more dedicated source where we're looking at lower impurities and therefore possibly a lower cost to the entire value chain. Yeah.
Good, very good. And I think maybe one very final question on shipping, Cheryl, which was one that came from the audience. Do we see any other new tech on the horizon? Is there things that might come forward in the in the medium to long term that could dynamically improve things?
I would say the CO2 shipping space is still in development, right? So everything is probably new, a frontier technology. As we mentioned, there are a lot of players. I mean, Shell, including Shell as well, looking at different designs, optimizing, let's say cargo tank designs to be able to find an optimal vessel design to be able to transport CO2 in the lowest cost possible. Yeah. So I think that's still ongoing. I think to reach the next stages, it's probably more fine-tuned on exploring different materials that are able to be able to provide the strength that needed, but also bring down the cost of building these vessels. I think tank design, cargo handling, as Eng Kyong was also alluding to, that's very critical. And I think that the other thing that we are working on is a lot of joint industry participation and programs trying to test and validate what were the right CO2 specifications will be. Yeah.
Thank you. Couple of questions have come into the chat as well, and maybe Dimitri, this is also a good point to come to you to start to kind of give us some perspective on the end phase for the CO2, right? The storage sinks. A couple of questions have come in around shipping companies saying they see underground storage as uncertain. I think most people in the oil and gas sector typically vehemently disagree with that from the off, right? Because this has been done before, and there's lots of experience, but of course, yes, there are going to be lots of different challenges. So maybe if we spend a bit of time now, Dimitri, on the storage side of things, on the sink side, what are some of the key factors, right, when you as developers are looking at the selection of these storage sites, and how does that give you confidence as a developer that you're able to move through your gating processes and really develop these sites to be safe and permanent?
Very good question. So of course that's our bread and butter is oil and gas companies. For CCS, as I previously mentioned, for CCS CCS value chain to be economic, one of the key levers is scale. So economies of scale is something that we are, as a project proponent, we are pursuing quite heavily. The main reason is that it just allows to reduce the unit cost for the customers. And therefore, the reservoir that we're selecting in the first place, it needs to be big enough. Right, so our capacity is in excess of 125 million tons. It gives us around 5 million tons per annum for 25 years. So this is sort of this could be the minimum sort of entry level for a large scale multi-user developments. So first of all, we look at the geology. We look where the reservoirs of high capacity could be located. One of the considerations is, of course, there are two types of reservoirs that can be used. One of them is a depleted or produced reservoir, and another is deep saline aquifer. There are pros and cons of those. So if we look at depleted reservoirs, then the benefit is, of course, operators would typically know those reservoirs inside out. They would have a lot of dynamic information, a lot of static information. They would probably have a couple of kilometers of core sitting in the warehouse, and they can easily characterize the reservoir. What it also gives is it gives the enormous amount of certainty that the gas that was there for millions of years was sitting in that place, and therefore it gives confidence that CO2 will be sitting in the same place. So that's part of the story. Of course, this needs to be balanced with the view on, well, how that field was developed previously. Does it have a lot of legacy wells, for example. There are a lot of examples globally where the reservoir is very good, but there are some wells that perhaps due to its design prevents using that reservoir for CCS purpose, where it doesn't potentially contain the CO2 and may have a migration path for CO2. So that's part of the story. So that's the depleted or produced reservoirs. And then saline aquifers, they are typically very large scale developments. They would have good rock. The disadvantage of them is that they need to be appraised. So there is a reason why we do not drill in those areas. That's because we know there are no hydrocarbons typically. And therefore, for any aquifer that we think is appropriate for storage of CO2, we would need to drill an appraisal well. We would need to do seismic surveys that generally comes at a cost, and also it's a longer lead development. It would require longer time to enable that. Then sort of if we look, closer on the reservoir, if I may speak on sort of put an Australian example, we have very strict regulations on what reservoirs should have in its properties to be able to become eligible for storage of CO2. There are certain rules, certain guidance that we have to follow, and regulator is reviewing that description of the reservoir, and they agree or disagree. So that gives confidence to the government, to the external stakeholders, that the reservoir that has been selected for CO2 storage is appropriate and will hold CO2 for indefinitely. So this is sort of in terms of the reservoir itself. Now there are other things as well that play a role. So preferably the reservoir needs to be located close to emitter's location, so that we could minimize the distance between capture site and the storage site. Shipping and pipeline transportation could be significant cost to the value chain. So preferably the reservoir should be as close as possible. And then we also look at different opportunities to repurpose various infrastructure. It could be wells, it could be pipelines. In our example, we are looking at repurposing a jetty, which is a piece of infrastructure that is quite handy if you want to consider bringing CO2 via ships. And then you don't need to build it. It's a deep port, no dredging, and it makes the whole scale of the development significantly smaller.
Dimitri, I think while you are on the mic, I think very clear that sequestration is one of the key roles that oil and gas companies have to play, right? It's the role that they will own, that they will operate within the value chain. How else do you see companies like yours playing in essentially the orchestration of the whole end-to-end value chain? The collaboration you have with emitters, with ship owners and builders, and other participants. It'd be good to hear some perspectives there.
Yeah, I think in short, the oil and gas companies, they have experience in most of those areas, ourselves. We do capture on our facilities. We do gas treatment on our facilities. We inject gas be it for storage or for gas lift or disposal. These are the things which are very familiar to us. Of course, within our capabilities is identification and characterization of the reservoirs and planning out the development plans, like injection plans for those reservoirs. This is within sort of the DNA of a typical energy company. With that also, so in summary, we do understand we do see the whole value chain and how the value chain could be optimized. The other example is we've actually been involved in developing different value chains, quite significant value chains. Again, just picking up the example of where Woodside was working together with Shell and BP and others is the Northwest Shelf project, which is where Angel is located. 35 years ago, we established an LNG value chain that started shipping LNG from Australia to our customers in Japan. That was a very significant undertaking, and oil and gas companies, they're very well positioned to do it once again.
John or Cheryl, if there's anything that you'd maybe also like to add to that from a Shell perspective.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Yeah, I mean, Shell and Woodside, and actually, I work with Dimitri quite a bit actually nowadays. But we have a long history of working together. But I think as Dimitri rightly pointed out, right? So if you look at the energy company, we obviously we have positions and capability within the upstream side, in which we are leveraging to enter the CCS on the store perspective. But actually, we work through the end-to-end value chain, and in fact we do see our role as trying to integrate across the end-to-end value chain. I'm just taking Shell for instance, right? Aside from being an emitter ourselves, yeah, in certain locations, and obviously we will have experience doing capture. We do provide our own capture technology in the form of CANSOLV. So that's one thing. So so for Shell, we do work quite closely with some of the emitters, power companies within Singapore, for instance, to understand what we can provide to help them on their capture side as well. Yeah. Then we are working with various different industry players, right from the emitters all the way across the value chain for transport, which I'm covering. But clearly, I've got colleagues who are also on the CCS business side, who are looking at store opportunities within the region and globally. So I've been saying, like, similar with Dimitri as Angel, we work very, very closely with emitters, not only on within Singapore, but also in Japan, in Korea. And our role is really to stitch together the end-to-end value chain. I think it's important to think that what we are trying to do is to design, and I don't really mean design in just a technical sense, but also a commercial sense, to link up the full value chain all the way from customer or emitter all the way to the store. And this also requires working very closely with governments, right? So we are often engaging them to understand and advocate for the conducive policy environment to make the full value chain work.
Thanks a lot, Cyril and Dimitri. That was really insightful. And Kyung, maybe I guess to have the shipping perspective as well, the shipbuilders or the shipyard perspective here. What are some of the key technical considerations on the shipping side that are really going to impact the ability to scale the market, or the ability to kind of really modularize the way that the sector is looking at this?
Okay, I think we are talking about shipping the CO2 as a waste here to the storage site. And we do get feedback from the sectors that the availability of the Type C tank and the lead time to build such a ship. I think you have all the numbers out there, and we are all kind of needing to build and decarbonize as fast as possible. So I think there is a gap in terms of realizing that, and also to understand by, let's say, by 2030, 2040, how much of such ship can actually realistically be built. That's on one perspective from the shipping side. The other is, I saw some question on board side. I want to point out that when you look at capturing the carbon on board the ships, right, from the perspectives of thereafter shipping, right, I would view that itself as what collectively one group of emitter, but it's more from the shipping side. So if you're land-based, one big stationary emitter, you can see the marine side collectively as one group of emitter, but varying in size from it's much smaller size on the ships itself, which then will aggregate and feed into the rest of the carbon value chain that we're just talking about here. And And then another perspective from shipping side, which the more I dive into this topic, I think the thing that we should be mindful that it's very expensive. Everyone's talking about that. After you capture, you purify to such a pure state, and you still kind of put it into the sink. And so I'm beginning to hear more feedback that can we just use it and put a bit more effort into utilization? Example, like into building construction materials or petrochemicals product, where you create a green product, a product that has a value as compared to a waste. So waste to usable product, CO2 derived product. In that way, then you can kind of lower the cost for the emitters. And realistically, kind of in addition to all the incentives and all the regulations and all the tax, to create a more sustainable pathway for these solutions to be both transitional and also truly a way to decouple from long-term perspectives. Yeah.
Thank you. So we are closing in on the last few minutes. So before handing it back to the hosts, what might be good is just to get, the quick 30-second, 45-second version from all of you around, what are some of the top immediate actions that you think, we as value chain participants, but also governments need to take in the short term. And maybe Enkiong, as you were last on the mic, I can start with you there.
I think the big question everyone need to decide on what is the CO2 specification. Once that get it out of the way, I think there are many other issues. But to me, this is one of the bigger issues that everyone need to come in collectively and decide what is the specs. Yeah.
Maybe Cheryl?
I don't know. I'm probably less optimistic, right? So I think there was a question about the impact on tariffs and trade. I feel as if there's so much uncertainty. What we do need right now is a true resolute action of someone taking and putting their money where their mouth is and really building a cross-boundary CO2 project. Yeah, I'm agnostic of the country and agnostic of the store, because I think for Asia Pacific, then it kickstart the industry here. And I think that was the belief of Northern Lights, and that's why the Norwegian government really put it there as a shining beacon, as a pioneering project for Europe, and I'm hoping the same happens within Asia Pacific.
Thank you. Maybe Alex, if you'd like to go next.
Agree with both of those observations, both excellent suggestions. I think speaking more generally, I think the whole issue of standardization, not just around CO2 specifications, but a common approach to regulation, a common approach or framework around bilateral agreements. I think that would be very valuable in terms of accelerating negotiation, cooperation, collaboration between governments and between project developers in Asia Pacific, to get to a point where there are agreements and standards and frameworks in place that can enable investment. So I think that sort of Asia Pacific standardization of a general Asia Pacific approach to bilateral agreements, for example, I think that would certainly accelerate developments in the region.
Finally, Dimitri.
Yeah, thank you. I would echo my colleagues on the panel. Government-to-government agreement is something that would allow, from the policy and regulations perspective, that's what would allow transboundary CO2 shipment to occur 100%. Having the first project is 100%. That's what we all would want to see, and seeing that project starting up reliably, safely is the most important thing. So yes, agree with all of that was said. I would probably add maybe a view on the partnerships. So forming the partnerships is very important. Creating the right partners within the value chain, or finding the right partners and creating those partnerships within the value chain with emitters, transporters, and the storage providers is also very important, because there is a lot to go through, a lot of things that we need to work on, standardization of different different equipment suits or specifications, commercial agreements. There's a lot. These value chains are very complex. So the sooner we get into that, the sooner we will get the first project off the ground, and hopefully government-to-government agreements will come along the way as well.
Thanks a lot, everybody. So as well as sort of chairing the virtual applause that I'm in no doubt is going on, I'd just like to thank all of the panelists for some amazing insights today. I think it's very clear that there's a huge opportunity here within the region to do this right. But we do need a lot of collaboration, a lot of partnership to make it work. So thank you again, and thank you very much for joining. Grace, I can maybe hand back to you for any closing remarks, and also thank the audience members for the Q&A throughout, which we will try and get to offline, but also your participation in general. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carl, and all the panelists for the very insightful discussion. Maybe before the closing remarks, right, from Grace, just would like to spend a quick minute on an announcement. As many of you may have already seen, right, back in 2023, GCMD and BCG together, we published the findings from our inaugural maritime decarbonization survey. And between the latter part of last year and the start of this year, we have been running a second round of these surveys, right? In addition to surveying over 110 ship owners and operators, as a new addition this time around, we've also surveyed and interviewed major bunkering ports. The report will be launched next month, so please stay tuned if you're interested. We have the QR codes here for the GCMD website and the LinkedIn page if you want to stay connected. Thank you. Over to Grace.
So thank you to all our speakers and panelists for sharing such valuable insights. And then thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Yeah. So at GCMD, we believe that convening the right stakeholders is a powerful first step, but it also must be followed by collaborative action, which is in line with what Dimitri and Carl mentioned earlier. So I understand that we are running out of time, so we invite all of you to continue this dialogue and join us on this journey towards decarbonization. Please visit our website and stay tuned for more pilots and initiatives from GCMD that are shaping the future of green shipping. So have a great day ahead, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.